I tried to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I tried to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I'm your host, Jesse Lawler, excited to bring you the 78th edition of this podcast dedicated to the improvement of your own brain by any and all means at your disposal. You might hear it in my voice. This is an early morning edition of Smart Drug Smarts. I think these are actually the first words I've spoken today other than maybe gargling a little bit of toothpaste. I don't think that counts as a word. But bright-eyed and bushy-tailed for this particular episode. And today we're going to be talking about something called, and this is a tough one to pronounce, so bear with me, Pycnogenol, which actually, if you look at the word, it's got a Y in it. It kind of looks like a Greek word, but it's spelled almost exactly like you'd think it would be. I'm going to say it one more time, Pycnogenol. But pycnogenol is one of these weird compounds that people say so many different things. It does this, it does that. It's used for everything from asthma to menstrual cramps to increased concentration to this bizarre spectrum of things that it's hard to imagine how they could all be coming from the same chemical. But as often happens, I guess, when you hear claims like that, it's coming from a plant rather than a specific chemically synthesized compound. So there's actually probably a lot of active ingredients inside what we think of collectively as pycnogenol, which is explaining maybe some of these varieties of effects. But we're going to be talking with Jeff Strong, who's a scientist who works with pycnogenol day in, day out, to give us the full lowdown on this plant compound, what studies have shown, and what we might think about using it for. That'll be in the main interview. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, in the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick, I'm going to revisit something. I think we actually already did a Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick around a similar topic many episodes ago, but we're going to revisit just how much caffeine it could take to kill you. This is something that I've been thinking about a bit because I have started actually sort of tracking my nootropic stack. The things that I take on a day in, day out basis are actually, it varies every day, so that's why I'm tracking it, because it's not the same on a day in, day out basis. But I was looking at my coffee intake from one day about a week and a half ago, and I realized, doing some back-of-the-napkin math, that I might have drank near a gallon of coffee over the course of the day. And I was just like, wait a minute, that might be pushing the envelope just a little, Jesse. So, Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick, should I have been worried about inadvertent suicide through my nearly a gallon of coffee day? Hang around for that. But first, let's do This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts. This Week in Neuroscience.
So this is an article from probably about 6 months ago. So it's not This Week in Neuroscience. It's 6 months ago in Neuroscience. But nevertheless, this one was new to me. I thought this was really interesting and wanted to get it in here. This is some new learning about the role of myelin in motor learning. So motor learning is learning related to physical skills, juggling, for example, riding a bicycle, stuff like that. In this case, it's rats running in wheels that have selectively rearranged little planks for them to stand on. So they need to run in this weird syncopated way so their feet don't fall through the cracks and yada, yada, yada. New stuff for the rats. What this study found is that something called glial cells, which are kind of like the Rodney Dangerfield of the brain. You know, neurons get all the glory. We always talk about 80 to 100 billion neurons in the brain. Aren't they amazing? They have these dendrites, they have these axons, they send signals around. We love them. And the glial cells are kind of these things that hold neurons in place and are kind of thought of as structural fibers that are kind of scaffolding, and that's about it. That's been the thinking. But apparently this study shows that glial cells are a lot more important than previously has been thought. So there's a specific kind of glial cell called an oligodendrocyte. And this actually extends part of its cell membrane around the axons of a neuron. Again, the axon is kind of like the primary fiber that signals are sent down. So the outbound transmission part of a neuron is called the axon. And an axon kind of has a sheath around it that both protects it physically and also helps keep the electrical signal that it sends strong. That's called a myelin sheath. We've talked about myelin before because one of the primary constituents of myelin is the omega-3 fatty acids that we know is important for brain and neurons, and that's one main reason why. But anyway, in these motor learning studies that they did with these rats, it turned out that when they turn off the oligodendrocytes' ability to be able to extend out their cytoplasm and their cell membrane to form these myelin wrappers, that learning cannot take place. And it was quite profound. It was a very binary sort of finding. It wasn't a general degradation of motor skills because things that had been learned previously were well maintained, but new learning could not get saved within the brain, at least within the motor cortex of the brain in this study, when they turned off these oligodendrocytes' ability to lay down their myelin, said Robin Franklin, a professor at the University of Cambridge. What this paper really does in a very compelling and elegant way is show that the glial cells perform much more important tasks than had previously been assigned to them. This paper is a significant step in a mounting body of work showing that glial cells, in their own right, have fundamentally important roles in the way that the brain works. William Richardson, director of the Wolfson Institute for Biomedical Research at the University College London, added that by finding a new mechanism involved in learning, it gives us a whole new target that in the future we might be able to manipulate in order to improve or accelerate learning. And that's the kind of thing that we are very interested in here on Smart Drug Smarts. And I'm very happy to say that we picked up a couple of 5-star reviews on iTunes this week from Sack of Woe and Apple's Grunt, respectively. Sack of Woe said, "Great interviews and guests, interesting viewpoints, and all-around goodness." And Apple's Grunt said, "Love this podcast. Produced very well with a wide variety of topics and guests. I'm always left wanting more." Thank you, guys. And speaking of wanting more, I'm happy to report that unbeknownst to everybody until now, there was actually a second episode of Smart Drug Smarts produced this week. We haven't released it yet. Probably going to release it in about a week from now. But we're doing something different where every now and then we're getting the opportunity to do another interview, kind of wedge it in somewhere. Sometimes they don't really exactly fit the format of sort of what the standard Smart Drug Smarts episodes are. So we've created something called an overdose edition. And the Smart Drug Smarts overdose editions, we got our first one finished now. I've got a couple of more in the offing. And what we're thinking now is that we're going to release these overdose editions through the Axon mobile app, which we've got up in the iTunes store for iPad and iPhone. Working on getting an Android version, although that is a project that really kind of got tabled for the beginning part of this year, but it is something that will be coming back to the fore probably in the third quarter of 2015. If you're an Android user and you're at your wit's end that currently there's not a way to get the overdose editions, drop us an email. We'll figure something out there as a stopgap measure. But yeah, for those people that are going to be using Axon, we'll be putting out overdose editions and probably some other content that's just going to go out that way. So to get Smart Drug Smarts on your smartphone, head to the iTunes store. The mobile app is called Axon. We've got a link on our website, of course, smartdrugsmarts.com. Grab that and we should have the first overdose edition coming out in just a couple of days. I always feel weird when I record something like just a couple of days on this podcast because I realize these podcasts are around forever. So it's currently May 29th of 2015 as I say this. But cool, that's that. So let's head on to the main interview.
Smart Drug Smarts.
Okay, so we're going to be speaking today with Dr. Jeffry Michael Strong. He is a naturopathic doctor and the Director of Scientific Communications for Horphage Research Limited. Now, I should put an asterisk probably right up front that Horphage Research Limited is in fact the manufacturer and distributor to the world of Pycnogenol. They have pycnogenol.com as one of their domain names, among other things. So, whereas a lot of the researchers that we talk with on this show are working for universities and academic institutions and aren't necessarily tied up so directly in the retail world of pharmaceuticals or nutraceuticals, Dr. Strong does work for a company that sells the very thing we're going to be talking about, which isn't to impugn his credibility or anything like that, but I think it is important to be aware of these sorts of things, and I'm going to try to be even more cognizant of that in the future, just kind of as we talk about different chemicals or technologies with guests who might have a financial stake in one thing or another, trying to bring that right out in the open whenever that's something that happens. So Pycnogenol, if you've heard of it before, you've probably heard of it in the context of anti-oxidation. For probably about the past 20 years, one of the main things that people are thinking about as a cause of aging and general cellular wear and tear within the body is something called oxidative stress. Obviously, if you remember even high school chemistry classes, oxidation is a chemical process that happens all the time within the cells of our body as different things get rearranged, broken down, energy released, things like that. So it's not like you can fully stop oxidative processes within your body. You wouldn't want to, you'd be dead. But the downside of some of these processes is the creation of things called free radicals, which to a certain extent can run amok within the body and cause secondary downstream reactions that you don't want to have happen. Anyway, long story short, antioxidants are things that we get within our diet which help damper down the negative effects of oxidative stress. So Pycnogenol is known to be quite a powerful antioxidant, and if you've seen it on the shelves in your health food store or heard it advertised, that's probably the context you've heard about it in. However, we're talking about it on this show because of the cognitive benefits that seem to also result from the use of Pycnogenol. We're going to start off with a general overview of the chemical, where it comes from and what it can do, but pay particular attention to the cognitive end of things, which is mostly in the second half of the interview. And with that as preamble, Dr. Jeffry Strong. Tell us about the history of Pycnogenol.
Originally, Pycnogenol, well, it's derived from a very specific, unique tree, which is the French maritime pine tree, which grows only in the southwest corner of France, just above the Spanish border there. The maritime pine tree grows all around the world, but this is a very unique region where you had a lot of factors that went into play. You had, salt water from the ocean coming into the land, and it was a very marshy area historically, and very, very poor area because nothing would grow because there was just too high mineral content in the soil and too much water around, basically. And during the time of Napoleon III, the French government wanted to develop some form of industry for the people in the area. And so they started planting this maritime pine tree there. For whatever reason, this pine tree really took to the area. And now it's one of the largest forests in Europe. Well, what made it interesting, though, is that over time, it became very clear that this species of trees was diverging from your typical maritime pine tree. If you look at maritime pine trees, even just down the way in Spain and other parts of Europe, you look at the bark thickness, and the bark thickness is on average of around 2 centimeters. But if you look at the average bark thickness of the French maritime pine tree, it's about double that, of around 4 centimeters. So very obvious physical difference right there. And then if you look at the quality of the bark, it's very, very deep red in color, even when you break it off and look at the inside. So it shows just even in the natural bark form that it has a very high concentration of these polyphenol compounds, of these organic acids that are the active components of pycnogenol. But even in the bark, it's a very high concentration. So it's the bark of this tree from which pycnogenol is extracted.
How did people first get an inkling that there was something worth extracting here?
Well, it was interesting because it came across a researcher in France who had a hobby, more or less, of reading old explorers' diaries. So these were like, in the old times with the wooden ships, the sail to America, trying to find the way to India, right? Mm-hmm. And there was an explorer called Jacques Cartier who, during the 1500s, got stuck in Canada in the wintertime. And his team started to come down with scurvy because they ran out of fresh vegetables and were running out of vitamin C in their diets. It was during this time that they met some of the Native Americans living in this part of Canada, and they came to the rescue of Jacques Cartier and his team. And what they did was they gave him a tea that was prepared from the bark and from pine needles. And there's a small amount of vitamin C in pine needles, but there's a very, very high concentration of these polyphenol compounds in the bark. Basically, the story is that almost everyone in the crew was saved as a result of just taking this tea. And this French researcher found this story, and it was kind of, like a aha moment to him that there's something good here that needs to be explored. And so he started doing research, trying to figure out what exactly is in the pine bark. And this was not very long after, the polyphenols had been originally discovered. He found that the pine bark was a concentrated source for these many different polyphenol compounds. Most abundantly are what they call very specific one particular type of proanthocyanidin, which is called a procyanidin. And a very high concentration of these with many different organic acids as well in there. If you consider what scurvy is basically a disease where it's due to a deficiency in vitamin C. But what happens when you run out of vitamin C is that your body cannot produce collagen. As a result of this, of course, your skin is the first thing you think of when you run out of collagen. Your skin's going to look terrible. And yes, that will be true, but it's not going to kill you. With scurvy, the problem is that our blood vessels are also made up of about 60% collagen. And so the body's not able to repair the blood vessels. And soon the blood vessels become weak. And in the case of scurvy, people die because their blood vessels break down and they bleed to death, basically. The researcher making this connection to scurvy, they started doing research into blood vessel health with this extract from the French maritime pine tree. They found that it was an excellent, what they call a vasotonic. It strengthened the integrity of the blood vessels. The research developing pycnogenol was in full force in the 1960s, and it was originally launched as a pharmaceutical product to improve blood vessel health in the sense of making the blood vessels stronger and also enhancing blood flow. In 1967 in France, it was originally launched.
And at that point, it was a prescription-only drug.
At that point, yes. It is still used as a pharmaceutical, mainly for this same purpose, for strengthening blood vessels and for heart health. Originally, it was developed as a pharmaceutical product only, and it was sold in numerous countries only as a pharmaceutical product. But then in the 1980s, there were changes in the regulations in relation to these type of products. What I mean by that is this is a natural plant extract, and it has a very, very high, strong safety record. And with extracts from natural source that have not shown any problems with safety, they were allowed to be used as health food supplement ingredients. With this change in the regulations, pycnogenol was then began to be sold as a health food ingredient, which it is most commonly sold as today. There was more interest in research of what else pycnogenol could do, and it was found that in the early 1990s that it happened to be a very, very potent antioxidant. It really grew in popularity and awareness in the 1990s.
That was when anti-oxidation kind of came into the popular literature and people started knowing what that actually even meant.
Yes, and it was found to be one of the most powerful natural antioxidant substances. And since then, it was found that pycnogenol, in addition to enhancing blood vessel health and blood flow, super antioxidant potential, and then it also has anti-inflammatory activity, which has been significant enough to show that it's able to relieve pain in like menstrual pain, even to the point of dysmenorrhea, or in the case of arthritis, joint pain. So it has a nice anti-inflammatory action as well.
If you Google pycnogenol, the number of things that it is recommended as possible cures or at least salves for is just all across the board. Everything from athletic performance to circulation to mental clarity and memory to erectile dysfunction to just all sorts of different things. If you had to broadly categorize where it's used most often now, where would you say?
In the United States, again, since it was originally developed with the antioxidant boom, I think it's still most well known as a super antioxidant there. It's interesting, it kind of depends on the country in the market. However, there's been a lot more expansion of marketing for pycnogenol based on the research that has come up. So you will see a lot more targeted formulations, say, for cognitive function, but also for women's health in the case of menstrual pain and these types of things. Pycnogenol is not a panacea. It's not a cure-all for everything. But when you think about what it does, it supports human health on a very basic foundational level with improving antioxidant status of the body. That alone has a very good anti-aging effect by decreasing free radical stress in the body. It is a very potent anti-inflammatory and reducing inflammation. There are many conditions that inflammation is a big part of. And so you can see relief of symptoms with many different conditions based on its anti-inflammatory action. And then, of course, improving circulation, blood vessel health, and blood vessel function. That is obviously vital for any kind of heart health related condition. Through these three actions alone, you see pycnogenol supporting a very foundational level of our health. And that's why you see it used with and showing good efficacy with so many different conditions that have been supported by the research. So
one counterindication I saw was for people that have autoimmune problems, that because of some of the benefits to strengthening the immune system, if you have any of these conditions where your immune system is actually attacking your own body, pycnogenol could do something bad, could work in the opposite direction by strengthening those attacks of the body on itself. Can you talk a little about that?
In my opinion, I think there's a little bit of a gap in the research here related to this, the use of pycnogenol in autoimmune conditions. So, I mean, until further research can be done to clarify that, maybe it's good to be cautious in these people. But I think it could also have a significant benefit because when you think about an autoimmune condition, basically it's a chronic inflammatory condition where the body's own immune system is attacking itself. So it's a double-edged sword. Pycnogenol could be working both ways here, and maybe there needs to be more research related to that. But I've heard reports of people who have rheumatic arthritis who have found significant relief when they take pycnogenol. So I think a little bit more exploration needs to be done here.
Are there any other dietary sources or ways that pycnogenol might make its way into a person other than this derived extract?
Yeah, and it's interesting because, you don't see a lot of people munching on pine bark in their diet, but the compounds that are found in pycnogenol can actually be found in various foods. There's no one food that contains all the compounds of pycnogenol in that one simple food source. But for the polyphenol compounds, the procyanidins and things, you can find some of these mainly in the skins of various fruits. You can find polyphenols in good concentration here. Of course, you will find a whole broad range of polyphenols in these fruits, whereas pycnogenol is a very high concentrated source of the procyanidins. But Within this, you can find it in fruits, vegetables, also nuts are good sources of these organic acids that can be found in pycnogenol, and even one special compound that can be in high concentration in pine bark, which is called ferulic acid. That's also found in small amounts in vegetables like red onions. So there are food sources for the compounds in pycnogenol, but it's very difficult to get them in a high concentrated source like you can get from taking, one capsule of pycnogenol containing product.
So for this audience, I think the cognitive benefits that can be gotten out of any supplement are going to be what's most interesting. Can you talk a little about the studies that have involved cognition?
Yeah, there's some very cool stuff that the research trail for pycnogenol related cognition has come a long way. It's been going on for over 20 years. Initially, it all stemmed from reports in the United States of physicians that were using pycnogenol to treat children with ADHD back in the mid-1990s. And it started getting these reports that were popping up, physicians that were finding very good success in relieving symptoms of hyperactivity and improving the ability of these children to concentrate with this natural compound. So there was a lot of interest there. And then this was followed up with similar reports coming out of Japan. And so it came to the point that, we really need to do a study on this. And so the first study was done in children with ADHD, and it was initially announced at the International Conference on Polyphenols in Helsinki in 2004. What they found was that basically these children taking pycnogenol compared to placebo, they performed much better. Their ability to pay attention improved significantly, as well as their hyperactivity scores improved significantly. So this was one of the first actual, double-blind placebo-controlled studies that showed that, yes, pycnogenol is having a significant effect at improving cognition, at least in these children with ADHD. And then after this, there research related to menopause, a study in menopausal women. One of the symptoms that commonly occurs with menopause is a decrease in the ability to concentrate, and memory problems are quite common with many women going through menopause. This was one of course, the symptoms that were investigated in this study. This was a 6-month-long study, 200 women involved, double-blind, placebo-controlled study done in Taiwan. And they found that after 6 months of taking pycnogenol, that there was 55% improvement in memory function.
55% sounds really, really dramatic.
It was very dramatic. And they were taking a high dose. I will admit it was 200 milligrams a day that these women were on. They also had a significant improvement in their ability to concentrate. Concentration problems decreased greater than 30% was reported in the publication on this study. And at the same time, there was a research project going on down in Australia. This was a study done in elderly individuals. Now, these were healthy elderly individuals. There was 101 elderly subjects in the study. They were aged 68 to 82, I believe it was. And they were taking pycnogenol or placebo over the course of 3 months. And they used standardized cognitive function assessment tests, which are basically done through a computer battery of tests. Basically, what they found was over 3 months' time, with placebo, there was minimal change of only 1.2% improvement, which was not significant at all. Whereas with pycnogenol group, the memory function score after 3 months of continued intake significantly improved. And associated with this, they also wanted to try and find out what one of the possible mechanisms may be. And again, here they investigated the antioxidant function, and they looked at one metabolite of oxidized lipids, which is called the F2 isoprostanes. And of course, the brain, with all the myelin sheath that surrounds our neurons, has a very low tolerance for free radical stress. When this free radical stress is high and the myelin sheath gets damaged as a result of this, this is believed to be one of the factors that contributes to this cognitive decline with age. They found that there was a very significant reduction in the amount of these oxidized lipid metabolites that were being seen. It reduced 23% over 3 months with taking pycnogenol. So very good results there. One of the things we want to look at here is how we can improve quality of life, improve brain function, basically cognitive function in already healthy people. Is this possible with pycnogenol? So this study basically involved college students, the average age of around 23. There was a control group and a Pycnogenol group, and they took a whole battery of tests. This was an 8-week-long study. The people in the Pycnogenol group were taking 100 milligrams of Pycnogenol a day. They did, again, a whole battery of cognitive function tests, tests for memory, tests for what they call mental flexibility. At the end of 8 weeks, they found that the cognitive function improved significantly in the students who were taking Pycnogenol. Particularly, there is a test called the paced auditory serial addition. It's a test where a number is given, and you have to remember that number, and then 1.5 to 2 seconds later, another number is said, and you have to add these in your head, and the process continues until there is a mistake made. Basically, the subjects taking Pycnogenol, they had a greater than 50% improvement in their ability to conduct this test. For memory recall, picture recall, they had a greater than 35% improvement here. And for logical function planning skill test, there is a test which is called the Stockings of Cambridge, out of Cambridge University. And their improvement in the ability to conduct this test, they improved by greater than 20% here as well. And then they also did another more subjective aspect to the study, was that they gave them a survey to ask them about their mood and their energy level, these types of things. They found that compared to the control group, that after taking Pycnogenol for 8 weeks, there was a significant improvement in the feeling of alertness. This was accompanied by a significant decrease in feelings of anxiety and a greater feeling of what they call contentedness or satisfaction with where they are in their life. So this was quite interesting too. The improvement in cognitive function, obviously this is affecting them on an emotional level, improving their alertness, nothing like too much caffeine, which will get you jumpy or anything like that, but the nice solid ability to concentrate improved, and that was clear with the test scores in this study.
What's the assumed mechanism of action for the cognitive benefits that we've talked about?
Pycnogenol significantly has been shown in numerous studies to improve the function of the blood vessels and help to lower blood pressure, which is also a negative factor in cognition as people age. So improving blood flow to the brain, of course, decreasing free radical stress in the brain, and decreasing inflammation in the brain. And I keep saying in the brain because there was a very interesting study that was published in the journal PLOS ONE in April of 2013. And this was research that's being done at the University of Würzburg in Germany. Basically, what they're looking at with Pycnogenol is, was there any chance that these metabolites of Pycnogenol were somehow being actively taken up into specific cells in the body, and therefore having a more effective action within these cells. What they found in this research, which was very cool, was that one specific metabolite of Pycnogenol, it's a valorolactone compound, was shown to be actively taken up into red blood cells. So what we're seeing here is that these metabolites of Pycnogenol are being carried and transported through the body in the red blood cells, which means they pass directly into the brain by virtue of this through the blood-brain barrier, which makes it kind of a new exciting dimension as to how Pycnogenol is having these effects and improving cognitive function.
So let me ask you this. You've listed a ton of great things about this substance. Where's the flip side? Where's the smudge on the silver lining?
The flip side of this, areas where it has really not been researched in or not shown good efficacy, I guess would be within intestinal health, for improving the intestinal environment. There's research lacking here, and there's not much to indicate that it would be that significant at improving intestinal health.
What would happen if one overdosed on Pycnogenol?
We haven't really heard of an overdose situation with Pycnogenol in the 40-plus years it's been on the market. These compounds, again, they're all found in different food sources. So to our body, they're not foreign. They're not considered toxic or dangerous substances to our body. Again, anything that we take, if you take it in excess, you can expect that there may be some ill effect from something. So far to date, we haven't seen any type of overdose symptoms with the dose that humans can or would typically consume. There's been research studies with heart disease patients with coronary artery disease, where they were given a dose of 450 milligrams per day. And there was no significant increase in any type of side effect reports with this study. What you can see with pycnogenol, particularly if you were to take it on an empty stomach, this is a natural extract that's a very high concentration of polyphenols with organic acids as well. So it can be very acidic in that sense, in that it can stimulate the lining of the stomach and be irritating to the lining of the stomach for some people on an empty stomach.
For yourself, your family, your loved ones, how much pycnogenol do you take per day?
I take every day 100 milligrams, and then there are days where I'm more active. If I'm exercising more, or it's a very stressful day, then I will double it up to 200 milligrams at times. My wife also takes 100 milligrams per day. I even give it to my children, particularly when they get sick, if they have a cold, or my son sometimes develop a little bit of asthma-like symptoms. And during that time, I give it to him. And with the anti-inflammatory action, it really helps to improve his breathing and relieve the symptoms there. So my whole family's been taking it for years now. And we're still here and still doing well.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so very much to Dr. Strong for telling us all about pycnogenol. One thing I found myself wondering after I did the interview was whether pycnogenol is technically an adaptogen. Adaptogens, you might remember, are herbs that result in the stabilization of physiological processes and promotion of homeostasis. And a lot of plant compounds that we tend to think of in the world of cognitive enhancers fall under that adaptogen umbrella. I'm not sure if the term adaptogen is even so well-defined or restrictive that based on what we just heard about pycnogenol that it would be possible to say it's not an adaptogen. I think it probably is. Well, one other thing that I want to mention, a word that came up in that interview quite a bit and actually comes up all the time when we're talking with scientists is significantly. And I feel like it's important to shine a little bit of light on that word in particular because it's this weird instance of a word that means something different in scientific speak than it means in everyday speak. And when you hear somebody say significantly on the street in a normal context, let me give you an example. Terminator 2 is a significantly better movie than Terminator 3. It means like really and conspicuously, you couldn't help but notice it. It's kind of a big deal when something is significant. Now, when scientists are talking about significance, especially about like a study, and they say, we found significant results, it does not mean significant results in the way that Terminator 2 is a significantly better movie than Terminator 3. It means that the results have met the minimum requirement showing they're not a fluke, that the sample size was large enough and the results were extreme enough that there's basically no chance that the results that were witnessed would never happen again. It was just lightning happening to strike that one time. It doesn't mean it was necessarily a huge result. So as you're listening to basically any science person talk for the rest of your life, just kind of always bear in mind that what's significant means when you're talking about scientific studies is not what significant means when you're talking about it on the street with your friends. So enough of that. Let's move on to the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
I've referenced my diet enough on this podcast, and I should characterize my diet as saying it's a non-static thing because I tweak around with it a lot. Right now I'm doing a 60-day-ish ketogenic diet experiment that I'm probably about 40 days into. Planning on getting my blood work done at the end of that time and kind of seeing where everything is stabilized, and I'll talk more about that process in a podcast in the future. But because I've been on a pretty much paleo diet, now sort of a ketogenic version of paleo, for the past couple of years, the beverages that I drink are pretty restricted. Basically, I drink water, tea, coffee, and before I went ketogenic, I was drinking a lot of coconut water as well. Coconut water is out now as it's still got a bunch of carbs in it, which kind of breaks the whole ketogenic thing. But anyway, so coffee was like one of my primary choices. If I want to drink something more exciting than water, coffee's kind of it. So not being a total shut-in recluse weirdo, well, being a total weirdo, but nevertheless not being a shut-in, I spend a lot of time in coffee shops, and I have to order a bunch of coffee, of course. And so I wound up drinking a lot of coffee, and it's not something that I dislike, but one is forced to consider just how much coffee one should be drinking. So a small handful of people, according to the FDA, die every year from caffeine overdoses. Now, the US FDA says that you can safely consume about 400 milligrams per day. But actually, an average venti-sized Starbucks has about that amount, so you can probably consume way more than that. And look at a study from 2005, which investigated 2 caffeine-related deaths and then suggested that you'd have to ingest around 5 grams of caffeine. That's about 10 times the FDA's figures to actually overdose. Other sources have said it's even more like twice that, which would be like the equivalent of 50 shots of a 5-hour energy drink, which I think If you've ever done even one shot of 5-hour energy drink, you would not consider moving on to 50. But according to Dr. Patricia Broderick, who is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Caffeine Research, yes, there is such a thing, we don't really know how much caffeine it takes to put you in lethal danger. Women are much more susceptible to caffeine than men are, according to Dr. Broderick, and also young people have much lower tolerances than older people. Probably most important is that the method of administration can really differ. Caffeine is most toxic when it's consumed intravenously, which few of us are doing, but could also reach lethal levels, taken orally, that's how we normally do it, rectally, that's not how we normally do it, or subcutaneously. And I have no idea how coffee is taken subcutaneously, but maybe there's like a caffeine patch out there or something that I don't know about. The lethal dose depends upon how the drug is administered, but it seems to be somewhere around 200 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So doing some quick math there for me, that would be around 15 or 16,000 milligrams of caffeine, equivalent to a low 30s number of Starbucks Ventis in a day, which luckily is significantly more than I've ever attempted. However, caffeine can make you feel pretty crappy before you'll actually drop over dead from it. Last year, the American Association of Poison Control Centers got over 3,000 calls from people that were concerned that their hearts were going to explode because of caffeine. Half of these people were age 18 and younger. Now, the vast majority of these people were not actually overdosing on caffeine, but they felt like they were, so it's still not a good thing. We probably all know the optimal amount of caffeine is going to vary person to person. So is the deadly amount, and the deadly amount is probably around 35 times higher. So you have to try pretty hard to actually kill yourself with caffeine. It's kind of in the realm of getting struck by lightning or getting eaten by a shark or one of these other exit strategies that you probably don't need to spend too much time worrying about.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title twice.
All right, so that is the entire episode number 78. Thank you for hanging around until the end. I would like to throw out a little bit of special thank you this week to Anthony Guevara, a Canadian currently in Australia who I met in Asia, sitting next to me in a coffee shop when I was talking about Smart Drug Smarts, lamenting the fact that there was a little software thing that I wanted to do that I didn't have a good way of doing yet. He introduced himself and said, hey, I happen to be a software developer and I couldn't help but overhear that you had this particular need. And one thing led to another, and he's now building something for us that will soon be a piece of the smartdrugsmarts.com website, which will be a really cool little feather in the cap for any and all of our podcast-specific post pages. Sorry about all the P's in that sentence. That didn't happen by design, just kind of did. Anyway, so thanks, Anthony. Speaking of smartdrugsmarts.com, all the links to everything that we talked about will be up there as usual, and I will be back at you next week, next Friday, same time, same podcast, and with the same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week in the meantime, and as usual, stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only. Although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not. And the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.